Kia ora, everyone. For the first book review of the year, I've chosen to review a book called The Unforgiven, Mercenaries or Missionaries by Ashley Gray. And it's the story of the 1980s rebel West Indian cricket tours to South Africa. Now, they were called rebel tours because in those days, sport and contact with South Africa was discouraged. Although, of course, it didn't stop the All Blacks playing them a couple of times, and we saw the impact that had on the country in 1981. But because of the apartheid system in South Africa, and apartheid was a system of institutionalised racial segregation that ensured South Africa was dominated politically, socially and economically by the minority white population, it meant that South Africa was effectively ostracised by the rest of the world. Now, in the 1980s, the West Indian cricket team was the best in the world, and in fact, arguably one of the greatest cricket sides of all time. In fact, from in a 15-year period from 1980 to 1995, the West Indians lost only the one Test series, and that was a 1-0 loss in a series to New Zealand in a controversial and acrimonious series that was held in New Zealand. One of the strengths of the West Indian sides of the 1980s was its magnificent fast bowling strength, and they had four fast bowlers at the time who were collectively known as the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Colin Croft, Joel Garner, who was 6'8", Michael Holding, who was one of the quickest of all time, and Andy Roberts. But their strength and depth was incredible. And there were a number of fast bowlers, probably another 10 or so, who could have performed almost as successfully at the international level. And you think about players like Sylvester Clarke at the time and Wayne Daniel and Winston Davis, who in any other era could have been greats of the game. And of course, you had young players like Malcolm Marshall, who was one of the greats of the game, who are just sort of coming into the selection framework. They also had some phenomenal batsmen. The King, Viv Richards, who was one of the greatest of all time, Gordon Greenidge, one of the best opening batsmen of all time. So they were a phenomenally strong all-round side. So it was a team that was really hard to get into. And there were a number of players on the fringe of that West Indian side, or a number of players who had only just finished playing for that top side, who really were struggling to make a living. Now, there are a number of rebel tours to South Africa. Teams from England, Australia, Sri Lanka went to the South African to play the South African national side, who were a very good side at the time. But the West Indians were a different kettle of fish. And Lawrence Rowe was selected. Now, Lawrence Rowe was a gentleman who, like one of our old boys, Matthew Sinclair, scored 214 on his Test debut. He was one of the greats of West Indian cricket. He was selected to lead the tour. And the tour organisers, because they had Lawrence Rowe, were able to attract other greats of the game like Alvin Kallicharran, Colin Croft, Collis King and Sylvester Clarke, who I mentioned earlier. And rounding out the squad was a number of fringe West Indian players and experienced first-class cricketers who were unlikely ever to get a crack at the full-strength side. The players were offered significant sums of money for the time to join. There were two tours, one in 81, 82 and another one in 83, 84. But the backlash was swift and ferocious back in the West Indies. Many saw the tourists as traitors to their race. They felt black men should not be selling their souls to play cricket in a country that treated the black population so terribly. But some of the players argued that they were determined to show white South Africa that black people were their equal and to open their eyes to what black people could achieve. Critics suggested that that was being naive, that they were being used as a tool to show the world that apartheid wasn't as bad, perhaps, as people thought. And the players themselves on those tours were sheltered from some of the realities of apartheid. Although Colin Croft was removed from a whites-only train carriage, he was quite pragmatic about the whole thing, said, look, he was breaking the rules, but he understands that that was the daily reality that black people in South Africa had to face. The tours were successful from a results point of view, particularly the second tour, where the West Indian side won both the one-day series and the Test series. But what was also noticeable, a lot of the players talked about how the fact that they were able to become popular with the white South African population and did really increase the popularity of cricket. They were incredibly popular everywhere they went. But the subtitle of the book, as I mentioned earlier, is Mercenaries or Missionaries, and that captures the attitude from a lot of people at the time. The tourists were all given lifelong bans from cricket in the West Indies, which was subsequently overturned a few years later in 1989. Some of the tourists, as professional or semi-professional cricketers, were being paid a pittance at the time in the West Indies. And from their point of view, they were being paid a sum of money that would give financial security to them and their family for life. Others saw it as blood money. Viv Richards famously turned down a blank cheque, and he said, look, no one could have paid enough money for him to become an honorary white man rather than a proud black man to play cricket in South Africa. Others said that Viv could afford to say that because he was being paid well to play professional cricket. So there were pros and cons either way you looked at it. However, they were breaking the rules, and as I said, in Jamaica in particular, this didn't go down very well. Now, the book looks at each of the players involved, gives a wee bit of background about them, but it also looks at how the fallout from the tour affected them. A number of them went to live in the States or in the UK. Some of them returned home, and once the lifetime ban was lifted, Ezra Mosley was one of the tourists who was still young enough to then get a crack at playing official international cricket. Franklin Stevenson, probably the greatest all-rounder that never played for the West Indies, he runs a cricket academy now. So a number of them have got involved again in coaching or administration, although the spectre of being involved in this tour still hangs over them to this day. A number of them had unhappy times after the tour. Some had mental health issues, some had addiction problems, a couple of them now live on the street, one of them died homeless, and part of the blame for their condition, they believed, could have been laid at the feet of the fallout from these tours. In South Africa, they were looked after extremely well. And they, as I said before, they were massively popular and were able to get black and white people mingling at the games while they were watching the cricket. Some believe that in some small way that they did contribute to the breakdown of apartheid. Others think they're naive to think that, but if they did play some small part in helping advance the cause of the black population in South Africa, then they believe that some of the fallout then was worth it from a personal point of view. A number of them stayed on to play in South Africa. A number of them became friends with the South African players and visited regularly, and a number of them did get the opportunity to play against them later when South Africa was readmitted to the fold of international sport in the early 1980s. It's a fascinating read, fascinating from a cricket point of view, but also fascinating from a social point of view, and how they experienced and what they experienced in South Africa and how that translated to how they were treated at home. It was a very, very tumultuous time in West Indies cricket and in world sport, with the South African influence causing a number of issues. And I referenced the 1981 Springbok tour earlier, but also for the 1986 All Black tour, or the 85 tour, then that saw the Cavaliers go in 86. So a fascinating book to read. Mrs. Langley's looking at getting this in the library. So if you're interested in cricket or in the political environment in South Africa at the time, then I certainly can recommend The Unforgiven. Thank you.